Kia ora, everyone. It's Chris with Earth Sciences New Zealand. After a bit of a hiatus, look, I actually had a summer holiday, and that was awesome. Took off about 30 days, never had a month off in my life, and got a bit twitchy at the end because I missed doing this, to be honest. And we're back giving you the outlook for the next 3 months. Also, we have another member of the seasonal outlook team that's going to be joining us, that coming in just a moment. Let's get to business. I'll disappear once again, and I will go full frame. Here is what you need to know. Summer is not over. Now, I know you're thinking, well, Chris, it's February. By the way, we are recording this on the second day of February in the afternoon, 2:30 in the afternoon on February 2nd. And you're saying, well, what do you mean? I know summer isn't over. Well, some of us have had some not really summer-like weather. So we're here to tell you that. Hang in there. There will be some nice spells of settled weather. Also, La Niña. It is here, but it is waning. It's losing its grip, but it is still going to be a factor. The atmosphere has a memory. So even when La Niña goes, its impacts may still remain. And because of that, we need to watch for some tropical rainmakers coming from the north. As you know, coming back full on screen, whenever our weather comes from the north, that really increases the odds for big rain events. And that's something we're going to have to be mindful of as we progress through the next 3 months. So let's get to it in terms of what to expect. I'll disappear again. This is the actual seasonal climate outlook as a whole. We're going to start with temperature. Now, where you see this deep red, that is where temperatures we feel most confidently are going to be above average. Yes, there'll be some cooler days, but that will not be the theme. Our confidence for above average temperatures for the next 3 months, not quite as high for the western and eastern South Island. So we're saying anywhere from near average to above average, somewhere in that spectrum. We think near average temperatures are the most likely outcome for the top of the South Island and for the eastern South Island. And for the western South Island, again, we think temperatures are likely to be in that average to above average sort of spectrum or category. In terms of rainfall, here we go. Above normal rainfall, that appears to be the most likely outcome for the upper and eastern North Island. We think basically airflows coming from the easterly quarter, so that is either north of east or south of east. That will be a theme. And as a result, that will give us opportunities for rainfall events. Some of those could be quite substantial if we get those connections from the north, as we anticipate. Now, for the rest of the North Island, for the western, North Island, there's about equal chances rainfall will be what it should be, normal or above normal. So that certainty, that risk for above normal rainfall, not quite as high. So that's why we've gone with that category. Near normal rainfall for the top of the country, top of the South Island, and for the eastern South Island, again, that normal or above normal. And if there's going to be dry weather, if there's going to be drier than usual conditions, we think that'll be for the western part of the South Island. Still a bit of uncertainty, hence we're going anywhere from normal to below normal for the next 3 months. Now, switching gears, let's bring the weather map on and also bring a friend. John Tunster, meteorologist John Tunster. Hey, John.
Hey, Chris. Welcome back.
Oh, thank you. Good to be back, and more so, welcome to you. So for those who don't know you and have the privilege of getting to know you, like I have over the past several months, tell us more about yourself, what you're doing, and who John Tunster is.
Yeah, so there's some boots to fill in a role here, and I stepped in to help out. Interestingly, I hit a bit of a milestone a few weeks ago. My forecasting career in New Zealand hit 18 years of age. So it came of age there. And now
legal, can vote.
Yeah, legal. So I'm testing out, adulthood in the SEO video.
Yeah, and we should mention for those who don't know John is from Met Service, but obviously given the direction of travel with Met Service and Earth Sciences New Zealand all becoming one big family, it just made sense to bring John into the fold, and it's been an awesome addition. And John's not only here to help us out with assembling the document of the seasonal climate outlook and really keeping an eye on all things long range. So anything, in fact, anywhere in that will be call forecast continuum from weather to subseasonal to seasonal. John has got us covered there, but also is going to help communicate what to expect. So that's why we're bringing John into the mix. So, John, we're going to start off in the weather space, and we have our pressure anomaly. Now, we mentioned at the beginning of the headline section, in fact, I'll just bring it up super quick, and I'll have us disappear, that summer isn't over right there. And I think this animation that we're seeing right here, that really speaks to that. So walk us through what we're seeing here.
Yeah, so kind of the traditional New Zealand summer pattern is these kind of migrating highs that push in from the west, and here's a great example that we're seeing later this week. And, we get these little troughs in between those migrating highs, but usually they don't tend to play such a huge role. They come through, they kind of, some of the older forecasters I worked with used to sometimes call them a weakness in the highs, and sometimes they wouldn't really amount to much, and then we get another high following in behind. And so we've got a bit of that going on.
So that's the red. So for those,
the reds, yeah.
So the red we're looking at, this is where higher than usual pressures forecast, and the blue is where lower than usual pressures forecast. And the weakness in the high, you said the kind of the OG forecasters. This right here seems like a good example of that, where there's some faint blue, right?
Yeah. It's, there's probably going to be some kind of front in there, but it's likely to get squeezed out by the next high pushing in afterwards. And so that's kind of a chance for a decent number of areas to see some more settled conditions than they've seen so far this summer. The highs should be more of a dominant factor than the intermittent troughs, I think.
And as we go farther afield, we'll save this a bit later on in the segment, and I'm just going to end when the data ends, which is the 12th of February. You can see it here. Walk us through what we're seeing up toward the Coral Sea and how that may be a harbinger of perhaps later on, of what's to come later on in February, in March even.
Yeah, so we're generally thinking that pretty much the next sort of 10 days, 2 weeks has a pretty good high dominance once we get rid of our current system that we're dealing with right now. But sort of from mid-month onwards and into March, we're going to have to keep an eye on the tropics again. Looks like there could be potential brewing up there. And that's what those low pressure anomalies are showing up there, that there's no guarantees that something will come down and affect us exactly, but we're going to have to keep a close eye on patterns like this developing.
Okay. Let's go to temperature. So I don't know about you. Okay, if you had to pick a field in meteorology, you can only look at one field. I'll tell you what mine is. It's 850. What is yours?
I have this old school thing as well where I also like 850 temperatures.
Stop
I'm sorry.
It. Stop it. You're just a man after my own heart.
They're a great field.
It is.
Once
so
you
we're
get
looking
used to them.
Yeah, but the reason we love it, certainly, and I think you feel the same way, but you can articulate your views, is that it really encapsulates a lot of things. It encapsulates the flavor of the air mass. So we're looking about a mile up, 1,600 meters above the ground. You have an idea of, is this kind of a chilly air mass, a warm air mass? And you can also deduce the flow by kind of looking at the gradient or the contours of the colors. So having said that, John, so blues, once again, is where unusually cool air is forecast, and the reds, that is where unusually warm air is forecast. And 3rd of February, so that would be Tuesday, you can see the warm air is leaving the country, but yeah, look what's coming toward us, and that is more blues. Have you seen what's going to happen in Christchurch in the eastern South Island, speaking of big temperature changes between today, Monday, when we are recording this, and tomorrow?
Yeah, I think we're well into the mid to high 20s, dropping down to the sort of teens.
Absolutely
tomorrow.
Incredible.
Yeah.
And this really shows it quite nicely. You can see this blue right over smack dab over the eastern South Island. Now, there are some blues over the upper North Island, so it will be cooler on Tuesday and especially into Wednesday than what we're seeing on this Monday. Absolutely gooey and humid in the upper North Island. But, John, it's really the South Island where it looks like these sort of puffs of cooler air are going to be an issue. Any kind of thoughts on that? Anything, expand on that? What's your 2 cents on that?
Yeah, so I guess that we're getting a bunch of highs coming through every now and then, and they're often originating in the Southern Ocean, so they're bringing up a bit of cooler air with them. it may not be that we're always going to see, Christchurch hitting a mere 15 degrees. That's kind of that's a bit of an outlier of a case. But we'll probably see some cooler nights, and we're not looking at things like low mid 30s, that kind of summer weather. But this cooler weather that we're seeing down south should still be associated with some settled spells as well.
Yeah.
So it is cold, but it may not always feel, if it's dry and it's sunny and it's summer and there's not much wind, even if it's a bit cooler than normal, it may still feel like, oh well, at least it feels settled.
Now, before going into a bit farther afield, the subseasonal, so 2, 3, 4, 5 weeks, Nilesh, your data scientist, right?
I don't think I've met him, actually.
You haven't met him? Well, you have to meet him. Smart guy.
Yeah.
He asked me for the Waitangi forecast for the North Island. And I mean, like, for those interested in the long weekend coming up, again, recording this on Monday, the 2nd of February, looking pretty good. This is the 6th, which I think, if I got my math right, that is the Friday. Looks like another puff of warm air comes into the North Island, and looks to be stubbornly cool potentially for the Western and Lower South Island. So I guess looking pretty good overall for the Waitangi weekend. Anything you want to add to that, or maybe I'm missing something? Thoughts on that?
Well, I think it's a whole lot better than the weather we're seeing for the South Island in the next sort of day or two.
Yeah, indeed.
Yeah.
So that's pretty much the next few days. We're going to be seeing, just to put a bow around this, high pressure, which is that red. That'll be a frequent visitor to the country and give us these extended periods of settled weather. The first couple weeks of the month, very little rain is forecast for much of the country, less, say, Fiordland or the western part of the South Island, and that is because of these sort of passing or migrating areas of high pressure that red. In fact, what we can do, John, real quick before we go to the subseasonal guidance, I want to bring up, we're going to disappear, buddy. We'll go full frame. So this is our ensemble model, and this is rainfall over the next 5 days. And you can really see how it's the eastern South Island that is forecast to get much of the rain through late this week into early Waitangi weekend. A lot of that's going to fall over the next couple of days. Some places like Kaikoura and the upper portion of Canterbury could certainly receive in excess of 100 millimeters. I believe there are some watches, weather watches up there across the upper portion of Canterbury and Canterbury itself, if I'm not mistaken.
That's right, yeah. We've got rain watches through Marlborough and parts of Canterbury at the moment.
Yeah.
And yeah, rain-wise, we could end up seeing, easily for several places, the whole month's worth of rain falling just in this event here.
Yeah, well, hence the watches, and that makes complete sense. But that rain, John, that seems to be pretty much... Oh, don't want to go there yet. Hold on. We knew this would happen, John. There we go. Hold on. There it is. We knew it would happen. I would mess up. The over-under was 2.5 minutes. Most people took the under. I did it in more than 2.5 minutes, so that's a win. So what we're seeing here in week 1, this is NIWA 35, so this is our 5-week outlook, so describing themes. So this is 7 days from the 31st, so basically this goes to the 6th of June. So this green here, that basically is in reflection to that heavy rain we're going to be seeing over Canterbury and the eastern South Island, basically Monday night and Tuesday, no?
Yeah, it's pretty much picking up entirely on that happening. Yeah, it's quite it's a decent system, that thing. Real big, as we've seen on the temperature maps earlier, big north-south contrast in air masses, incredibly warm and humid up north, and pretty darn chilly down south. And that temperature contrast is, the kind of thing we associate with these frontal boundaries that can produce decent rainfall. So yeah, it's basically it's highlighting what we're going to see over the next sort of day or so.
And look, as we kind of scroll through, so this is week 2. We're looking at the period of the 7th through the 14th, Valentine's Day. Dry. That's the thing for the North Island, and some of that upper part of the North Island, some of that deeper brown could be well below normal in terms of weekly rainfall. That's that high pressure you spoke of, the migrating highs.
Yeah,
right.
This is what I'm thinking of with the traditional summer pattern. that I was
Right.
talking about, where it's primarily settled and dry for this period. Temperatures will be a bit of a mix. As we saw, could be cooler than normal over the South Island, but still dry and mostly settled. Which, compared with what we're going to see today and tomorrow, it's significantly better than that. Much more summery.
And that looks like, mid-February, the 14th to the 21st, we're still seeing a dry signal for much of the country. I mean, obviously this will change. I like to remind people this is a theme outlook, not a weather forecast. So,
Yeah.
Odds are there'll be some updates to this as we move through the next few days, several days, in fact. But one of the things I want to kind of draw people's attention to and kind of set you up to speak about is what we're starting to see some evidence of probably very late in the period, up toward eastern Northland, maybe around Tadafati, Gisborne, those, albeit small, but certainly sticking out areas of green. Because, John, if we go to the next frame, what do we see? So walk us through what's probably going on here in terms of airflows and why we're seeing what we're seeing.
Yeah, it really starts to dig in on this week 4. It starts to hint at it on the week 3, but you can see it setting in as we progress later in the month. We're basically looking at those highs sitting decently far south and bringing an easterly quarter anomaly to the upper North Island. And easterly quarter anomalies will give us the potential to tap into some quite warm seas off to our northeast, which we'll see coming up later in the show, I think.
In fact, yeah.
And we'll have to watch for, this is the period where we were talking about earlier, where we'll just have to keep our eyes on things coming in from the north. And yeah, that pattern really digs in right at the end of February. We've been watching this period with great interest for quite a while, actually, and we need to keep a close eye on this.
So let's go to ocean temperature anomalies. So here we are on the 7th of December, and let's talk about the climate drivers. So this is typically what, this is called the nerd alert. So look, if you don't like nerdy things, if you don't like technical stuff, pardon the grammar, you ain't got to go home, but you got to leave here. No, I'm kidding. Please stick around. Maybe you will like it. But this is where we kind of understand why we're going to be seeing what we're going to be seeing, at least what is our MO, modus operandi, what is driving our thinking. So we start with ocean temperatures, and just to set you up, John, for those who maybe haven't watched it a bit, first-time viewers, thank you for joining. Long-time viewers, glad you're still with us. So what we're looking at here are ocean temperatures from a difference from normal, difference from average. And back in December, early December, this was the state of play. And I'm just going to take us off the screen, John. You can see that we had this wedge of unusually cool waters over the central and eastern Pacific. And meanwhile, over the far western Pacific into the maritime continent, which is Papua New Guinea, far northern Australia, Indonesia, and over the far western Pacific, we see this area of unusually warm ocean temperatures. John, I'm going to play this out. It's going to be radio right now, but walk us through what we're seeing.
Yeah, so it was pretty interesting how we finally got into our La Niña pattern around this time, and it pretty much peaked, I think, in late December, and that's basically the cool waters that we're seeing in the central Pacific. And prior to that, we did have, just at the tail end of the previous period, just a decaying negative Indian Ocean dipole, which is, you did warn, this is nerd alert.
Yeah.
So that
was... hold on, jumping in. What is the IOD? What is the Indian Ocean dipole? Why? I'm going to shift our focus a little bit farther to the west so you can, go for it, buddy.
Yeah. So this is right at the tail end of it. It was pretty much decaying by this point, but you've always called this the ENSO, which is El Nino Southern Oscillation, ENSO's cousin in the Indian Ocean.
It's
and it
cuzzy.
basically measures, basically measures the a dipole, which is two different points across the Indian Ocean, and a negative Indian Ocean dipole basically says that the waters roughly off the island of Sumatra are much warmer than normal, and the waters off Eastern Africa are much cooler than normal. And that has quite a significant impact on driving rainfall patterns over northern Australia, does have a kind of lagged impact on New Zealand. And it's difficult to disentangle it from La Niñas, which it often is coinciding with. But it does have this tendency to produce the kind of patterns that we've seen in January for New Zealand so far, which is, potential for a decent amount of rain in the upper North Island. So even though it's a long way from us, just like ENSO is a long way from us, it is pretty important to driving our patterns. But it pretty much always decays away by early January. That event, there were actually a few interesting historical events that went on. That was one of the strongest negative Indian Ocean dipoles that I think we've ever seen. We'd have to run stats to be absolutely certain of that, but it was certainly a historical event.
So what does it do for us then? Like, what would historically a strong negative IOD Indian Ocean dipole mean for us? Now, it's in the rearview mirror. It's not really a factor anymore, but would that give us better chances for atmospheric rivers? Does it tend to increase the odds for dryness? Historically, what does it tell us?
It can correlate quite strongly with more northeasterlies than normal over New Zealand in the months following, which coincides with La Nina anyway. So it can act to reinforce an ongoing La Nina, which is its older cousin in the Pacific.
So what are we seeing? So our ocean temperatures, go ahead, John, I cut you off. What were you going to say?
Oh, no, it's all good. I'm just getting carried away with history. On the more local to us, that enormous blob of warm waters that you're zooming in on there, just to our northeast, that pretty much originated in November in the Coral Sea and sort of Western Pacific. And that was incredible. I'm pretty sure that we ran some stats on that, and it was the top ranking sea surface temperature anomalies for many decades. I've forgotten exactly how many decades, but many of them, at least 40 years, I think. And that's basically been persisting and migrating ever since. And we've been able to occasionally feel the impacts of that in various weather events that we've seen. It gives us a boost to our temperatures, and any rainfall events that source their origins from there can get quite a decent boost, as we've seen in the Bay of Plenty events from a week or so ago.
So basically, if we have airflows coming from the northeast, or if we have weather systems sort of passing over this area of unusually warm temperatures, that could have an upward influence on the amount of water vapor available, and that water vapor can turn itself into heavier rainfall. Is that about right?
Yeah. It's not a one-to-one relationship. The fact that warm water is there doesn't guarantee that we'll get such events happening. We need several things to coincide, and that's just one of the factors. But even if the weather systems and the water don't coincide, even just having that sitting quite close to us gives an upwards boost to our temperatures and the high humidity levels that we've occasionally seen ever since November on occasions across northern New Zealand. Quite a decent few pulses of that we've seen.
John, if you really want to get to know somebody, it's one thing to have a conversation at the surface, but you really have to go deep and underneath the surface to really understand how a person is wired. And that is the same for the ocean. So what we have here is we're looking at, I know you know what you're looking at, but for our viewers, we're looking at kind of a cross section. Think of it as if you're going to an aquarium. And over on this side of the aquarium, where the pointer is, that's toward the far eastern Indian Ocean, north of Australia. We're around the equator, so we're up near the equator. And this is the far western side of the near equator region. And way over here toward Mr. Tunster, Mr. T, as you like to call him, this is going towards South America. And I mean, this is just dripping with nerdism. I mean, you can just like geek out. So John, you have the floor. I'm going to hush up. Why is this important, and what can we deduce from this?
So one thing that you can see from this is only a few days old. Cold anomalies in the central Pacific Thank you, Chris. Exactly. But they kind of give the impression of being under siege by warm anomalies from all angles. And this is basically pretty important for us because even though we're in La Nina conditions right now, which is cold sea surface temperatures in the Central Pacific, and we're expecting those to gradually wane in the near future, there's a whole lot of warm water sitting around in various locations, which has significant potential in later this year to reach the surface in the Pacific. And that means something very different to La Nina. La Nina's brother, El Nino, is
El Nino.
It's not a surefire thing, but it's very much on the cards at this time of year. It's usually quite difficult to predict, but
So just peeling this back a bit. So if we showed this same image from say 2 months ago or 6 weeks ago, it was blue city, wasn't it? Like this entire region that we're pointing to was entirely blue, and even some deeper shades of blue, indicating, a mature, weakish La Nina, indicating cooler than average ocean temperatures. But all of this unusually warm water at depth that has made its way pretty quickly to the east. In terms of how long it takes for this process to unfold, like we're not going to have El Nino tomorrow, is what I'm saying, right?
No. It's a multi-month process. It takes a long time. There's both oceanographic factors going on and there's meteorological factors. So it's it's driven both by the climate and by the ocean currents and waves within the ocean. And we can actually touch on the IOD we talked about. Some of that warm water that we're seeing in that anomaly actually came from that historic negative Indian Ocean dipole event. And that is kind of a useful predictor in some cases for future El Niños, because it can very, very, very slowly be transported eastwards. And as we said, it takes months. El Nino is not on the cards today, tomorrow, next month, or the month after. But it's not impossible that we see it this winter.
So if La Nina is on its way out and El Nino's not knocking at the door, but we see the car coming up the street, why are we expecting the prospect? Why is the prospect for big rain events? Why is that still with us? Why are we seeing, what is the reason for that? And I'm going to set you up here and go to our velocity potential. So velocity potential, for those who may not know, we're looking at the atmosphere. So the ocean is one facet of ENSO, El Nino Southern Oscillation, and the atmosphere is the other. And they got to be doing the dance together. And so this is one way of understanding how the atmosphere is behaving. And just before I hand over to John, we're seeing some cooler colors, which is enhanced or unusually strong lift, or I guess more precisely divergence, but we'll leave it at that. And where the warmer colors are, that is sink. So that promotes dryness. The lift promotes wetness. How can we be looking at this risk for enhanced heavy rain events, March and April, when by then La Nina is probably gone?
Yeah, it's a good question, Chris, and it pretty much always comes up when we're seeing these decaying events. The reality is that the ocean atmosphere system is quite a complex system, and a waning La Nina has never been an off switch for New Zealand. We often see lagged impacts from it persisting for months after the event has actually occurred. Sometimes those impacts may not necessarily persist constantly, but they may just pop back in every now and then. And I think I remember that back in the last time we saw, so if we go back to 2023, we were coming out of a very long multi-year Niño, which fairly quickly turned into an El Nino later that year. We still occasionally saw some La Nina type impacts during that transition. So it's basically just not, it doesn't switch off and switch off all impacts for us. It's a transitional period.
Gotcha. And on that note, so what we see forecast in January is enhanced lift over the maritime continent, over the Central Pacific, Central Western Pacific. There is forecast to be enhanced sink. But John, as we walk this through into February, you can see how that sink kind of gets, I mean, do you buy that, or you think that's a bit sus?
It's tricky. I think that it's probably not entirely incorrect, but it's if that really does happen, it's very confined to the equatorial region. We could still be seeing developments coming out of the more local tropics for us.
Coral
I still
Sea.
think that, the Coral Sea, that sinking that we're seeing there in those images there, they line up pretty well with sort of the peak of, or quite close to where the cold La Nina sea surface temperature anomaly is.
By the way, good stuff, John, because our chief executive just walked by, so we got to make sure we put on a good show here. You keep going.
I think it's just natural, yeah.
Go ahead, man.
But yeah, we shouldn't relax too much with this, because if we think about the tropical cyclone season so far, it's been another quiet start, similar to last year. I'm pretty sure that at the time we're recording this, I don't think that locally in the Southwest Pacific we've had a named tropical cyclone. We had Koji off the Australian coast, but in the Southwest Pacific we've not had a named system yet, which is fairly rare to enter February in that state.
Came close last week, though, with that unfortunate event. That was close to a TC. But that was also a reminder that you don't need a proper TC to cause really bad impacts in terms of an ex-tropical cyclone. So as we move through the rest of summer and into autumn, we start to see something quite profound happen. And that really occurs between April and June. So just to set you up, John, and then over to you. So we see this, actually, I'm going to go full frame, buddy. So we see this rise that is forecast over the maritime continent into the Philippines. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Pacific Ocean, we start to see this sink beginning to emerge. And if we go into May and we go into June, what's going on, John? What do we see here, buddy?
It's pretty incredible. I think profound would be a pretty good way of putting it. That's a dramatic flip of the atmospheric circulation system. Effectively, what we're seeing there in the June setup is a very El Nino type setup in the actual global atmosphere. So it's possible that it's getting a bit ahead of itself in terms of coupling the atmosphere and the ocean very, very quickly. We shouldn't guarantee that that's going to happen as fast as what this implies, but it is showing that the atmosphere is trying to shift to a very El Nino type pattern, where the lift is in the eastern Pacific, which is where the warmer sea surface temperature anomalies would be, and the sink is over the maritime continent, which is where it would be potentially slightly cooler. Although in this new normal, things get very interesting with exactly how these sea surface temperatures will end up looking.
And what does history tell us if we have a warm phase of ENSO, otherwise known as El Nino, knocking at the door, or perhaps even existing as we work our way into winter? Does that promote dryness, promote wetness? Any thoughts on that? I mean, we're looking way ahead, of course, but look, this is a bit of a nerdy section, so we have that latitude.
Yeah, it's it would, if it did have a direct impact on us quite quickly, then we would see far fewer of the easterly, northeasterly events, and we would expect to see more southwesterlies. So we would probably see more of a favoring of what tends to happen with our local pressure patterns as we go into winter. As I said earlier, when we're in summer, we get the highs that they're pretty much sitting in the Australian bight, south of the continent, and they migrate into the Tasman Sea, onto us and east, and they bait in a traditional summer pattern. That's what they do. But in winter, they retreat over the Australian continent. They end up anchored over the Australian continent, and what that tends to do is put us into a southwesterly airflow. So typically that would be relatively cool and dry for some areas.
Yeah.
But wet for the southwest of the South Island.
Right.
So yeah, that kind of cooler southwesterly idea is very different to if we sort of think back to last winter. We saw a number, I think especially in June, we saw a number of sort of subtropical sourced rainfall events. For example, in Nelson, in late June. Now that sort of thing, all else being equal, you would expect would be somewhat less likely in an El Nino winter. And you could instead see quite dry, cooler conditions.
Well, plenty of time to watch that, but good to know that that is something that we'll be keeping our eyes on over the coming weeks and months, the evolution of how our ocean temperatures, how they basically emerge. We have all this warmer than usual water beneath the surface that will likely surface. How it does that and where it does that and when, that is a detail that remains to be seen. But what we can say, John, for the next 3 months, as we go full frame, kind of putting a bow around things, is that we have above average temperatures most likely for the top of the country. So that is the north of the North Island, with warmer than usual temperatures, not quite so confident for the rest of the North Island. So let's think about impacts, John. What does this mean for people? What can we tell people? How can people use this to their advantage, as a 3-month long range outlook? Obviously, there's different audiences, farmers and energy and, simple families, in terms of, people trying to understand what to do with this information.
Yeah, for the temperatures, I would say that it's pretty interesting for east coast of the eastern parts of the South Island, especially for crop growers down there. Might want to be aware that temperatures will occasionally struggle at times, and this in our new normal of the climate, an average temperature forecast is not something that we see as often as we used to. We tend to have a warm lead these days, so an average forecast might actually feel cool to a lot of people. And in terms of rainfall, this is the holy grail of outlooks and weather forecasting and climate outlooks going full frame. Look, I guess the key messaging is the risk for heavy rainfall events. No? Yeah, definitely. It's targeting those areas where we've seen events already so far this summer, upper and eastern North Island, with a very clear above normal signal. And then, the eastern South Island, again, onshore flows, potentially promoting above or, tents on the wetter side of normal at the very least. And, the interesting thing is that the event that we're seeing pretty much over the next day or so is kind of like a trial run of that kind of pattern. It's it's a easterly rain event, and gonna get a whole decent bunch of rain in the eastern South Island. Meanwhile, best chance of being dry is going to be in the western South Island or the lower South Island, which is actually where we've already started to see some dryness pop up. I don't think we have a soil moisture deficit map in this image, in this show, but I think, things are looking pretty dry in the rainforests of Fiordland at the moment and parts of the deep south.
Yeah, you're right. We don't have the soil moisture anomaly map in this image, so you're absolutely right in this show. That's a really good point, John. I do think. I guess one last question before we go and putting. I'll put this back on. So, disappearing. Summer is not over, right? We still have some summer weather in terms of dryness and periods of warm weather, but we just got to keep our eyes to the north, especially North Island, as we work away. Yeah. Probably the second half of February is when things may start to get more active.
So. Yeah. Yeah, we've got these, we're going to see a decent bunch of highs over the next 2 weeks once we get rid of this current system. But then as we get into the second half of February, especially later February and possibly into early March, we're going to have to keep our eyes to the north. And just bear in mind that even just purely on a statistical, historical measure, February, March is pretty close to our sort of peak climatological risk of an ex-tropical cyclone passing close to us.
Excellent
so even
reminder.
though the tropics have been quiet so far, don't think that that's the end of them.
Yeah. All right, on that note, we'll leave it there. For myself and Mr. T, John Tunster, thank you for watching this latest seasonal climate outlook. If you want to read the document, it's fine reading. John had a big hand in writing that. You just head over to, it used to be ogniwa.co.nz, but I think if you put in Earth Sciences New Zealand, you get there anyway. Have a read at that. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time. Ngā mihi nui.